Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here, coming out. I feel like we're on the verge of spring, and it's hard to know which way the week is going to go. But nevertheless, we're all here, and I'm grateful to spend this time with you. The topic I chose for today is, which way will I choose? Because I think it's very important for each of us to consider who we are in our life and recognize that none of us will be free from temptations or challenges in our life, and to be prepared for them when they come along so that we're not caught off guard or fall into the trap of making selfish decisions or destructive decisions without being prepared, without being aware. And I was thinking about this because as Mike mentioned last Sunday, a couple weeks ago, there was a situation where our son's guide or teacher in school was arrested for sexual assault. But not only that, in the last few months, many people actually that I know personally in some way or another have ended up in a situation similar to this. I have a family friend that I've known since I was a young kid, lives near my parents. Around Christmas time, he actually shot and killed somebody who trespassed on his property. And we know an acquaintance of ours who is facing jail time for fraud. And I'm like, wow, I think these are the types of things that happen in movies or happen to other people. Or, I don't typically think of these things as being close to home, or that people I know are faced with these kind of challenges or making these sorts of decisions. But it really highlights for me that we are not exempt from facing difficult decisions. And even the best of us, like these people that I'm speaking of are people that I would have considered friends, that when you meet them, you think they're a nice person. They don't give off bad vibes. Or, you don't see them and think, oh, that's a bad guy. One of Mike and my favorite fun movies to watch that we never get tired of is, what's it called? It's not Date Night, it's Get Smart with Steve Carell and Tina Fey. And it's kind of a spoof on 007 or Mission Impossible. They're these like secret agents, and they're flying on this plane, and they and then she's like, use your peripherals, and he's like he can't, so he like looks behind him, and there's a huge guy at the back of the plane, and they're like, it's the Easter Island guy. Like, he looks like he's one of those monstrous stone statues from Easter Island. He's like, oh, that's a bad guy. That's a really bad guy. Like you could tell this is a bad guy. But in life, it's usually not like that, right? We don't see a person and think, oh, that's a bad guy. We don't see ourselves and think that, right? So, and yet these things happen. So how do we prepare ourselves to make the right choices so we don't end up becoming one of those bad guys? When it makes me think about when I was in school and growing up, and we would have history class, and we'd learn about people like Hitler or Stalin, or George, on the other side, like George Washington, people we think of as heroes and villains. And in our minds, I think, especially as children, but even now, it's easy to think, well, that's another time, that's another place. Those are different people. And it's easy to just try to memorize the facts, and because we have to for tests, but not necessarily learn the lessons that are there for us to learn from, whether it's in the Bible or in history or the things that are happening in our current events in life. One thing that I really love about Acton Academy, which is the type of school that I am also running here, is that every day we engage in Socratic discussions. This is where every day we ask these young people tough questions that don't necessarily have a clear yes or no answer. You know, if you ask, well, do you think it's a good idea to steal? Obviously, somebody's gonna say, well, no, of course not. We're not asking those kind of questions. We're putting them in the shoes of a historical person who had to make a very difficult decision, and then asking them, well, what would you do and why? And it really helps them to dig deep into understanding, how do I operate? How do I make difficult decisions? And is there something that maybe I should shift? So for example, I'm going to share this story, partly because I related to it myself, but I think it kind of sets up how we look at ourselves and how we make our decisions. So in history, just a couple weeks ago, we were learning about the history of Mexico and their attempts to get independence from Spain. I actually don't remember learning any of this in school, so I'm learning a lot. But there was a priest in a rural village in Mexico, and he loved to read. He was already almost retired. He was like 60-something years old, and he was leading his spiritual community. He loved to read. He loved his vineyard and his orchard. He loved his cat. But the thing is, he loved to read the works of French revolutionaries, and he loved to learn about the American independence. And he was starting to think and ruminate on this idea that we're all endowed with certain unalienable rights, freedom and liberty and equality. And those were rights that he and his village did not have under Spanish rule. However, word got out that he was reading these things, and he was seen as, by the authorities and the government, as a dangerous individual. So the government sent soldiers to his home and burned everything down, set his vineyards on fire, burned his house. And this was kind of the last straw for this older guy. He's like, that's it. I can't take it anymore. So he started to speak, instead of just reading, he started to speak out loud, and he inspired his village and the surrounding villages, and soon he had an army of hundreds of people who were like, well, let's do something about this. So they started to march toward the capital city, and he was really inspired about equality and liberty and maybe a little bit of revenge. And this group of his soldiers got to the first city, and they just like flattened it. His goal was simply to take the government and then continue on to the capital. But he couldn't control his soldiers, and they massacred like 400 men, women, and children. That wasn't his intended goal, but it's what happened. Then they continued on to the capital. But when they got there, he paused because he didn't want what had happened in the previous city to happen in the capital city. But because he paused, he camped out for a couple of weeks outside the city, the government had time to amass an army, and then they attacked his army. They were dispersed, he was tracked down, and he was executed. So this isn't like, I think many times we hear historical stories and we hear about George Washington took the risk and he crossed the Delaware River and gave hope to the Americans, and we won the Revolutionary War. This isn't one of those kind of stories. And actually, most of the stories in history are more similar to this. But what I thought was really interesting was not the story, but the discussions that we had afterwards. So first we had the discussion of, if this was you, if you were getting older, you were kind of retired peacefully, but taxes keep getting higher, You weren't free to think or say the things or read the things that you want to read. And then somebody comes and burns down your home. What would be the last straw for you? What would push you over the edge to leave your comfortable life and to be willing to risk everything? Is it your freedom? Is it the taxes? Or is it revenge? Like, if it was you can even think for yourself, what would actually be the thing that would push me over the edge, that would make it worth it for me to risk everything? And then another discussion we had was, if it was you and you had already gone through this first village and your soldiers had killed all these people that you didn't want to have killed, when you arrive at the capital city, what would you do? Would you pause like he did because you don't want to kill more innocent people, but risk the possibility of giving the enemy more time and perhaps prolonging the whole independence movement longer and causing more bloodshed and casualty over the next 25 years? Or do you ruthlessly stomp through the city, do whatever it takes to win your independence and maybe win it early? Do you have an easy answer to that? It's a little, we have hindsight, we can see what actually happened, and we could think about, well, maybe there's a different way to do things. But the reality is there are many people in history who are faced with these kinds of decisions that don't have an easy answer. And it's easy to think, well, it's not me, and honestly, probably if it was me, I would never have done anything to begin with. I'm too passive. And so we can think, well, that's somebody else. That's not the kind of situation I'm in. I'm not a historical person. I'm not a central figure in the Bible. But in some form or other, we will all end up in these type of situations in our life. Maybe it's not going to affect be life or death for hundreds of people. Maybe it's not going to make the difference of whether we end up in jail or not. But even if we're never leading an organization or having to make decisions in war that mean life or death, even if we're never handling other people's money, we are still going to be in a position to be a leader in our own family. We're still going to have to make financial decisions that impact our children. We still interact with many, many other people in this life, and that our decisions will have an impact on them. I'm really grateful for these types of discussions that we have in school, because daily I'm looking at myself and thinking, well, what would I do? And it makes me be very clear on my role as a guide, taking care of other people's children. Makes me very clear in my husband's and my role as pastors, where we actually do have access to people's money. We have access to what some people would call power. I don't think that's not how I look at it. But there are so many pastors who do actually take advantage of those roles, right? And so many times I find myself, even when I make myself a cup of coffee during the school day, I'm like, wait, I'm using the church's coffee. Is that appropriate while I'm guiding at the school? But I'm in the church. And I start to think, and I'm like, well, does it even out? Because we brought eggs over to the cafe for them to use. And we donated eggs, so does the eggs equal a coffee? I don't want to take advantage of the freedom that I have and the role that we have, right? I'm always questioning if what I'm doing ethical, and is it what God would want me to do? But how can we ensure that we make these right choices? And recognizing that many of these people didn't start out thinking, oh yeah, I want to take advantage of children, or I'm going to embezzle millions of dollars, or I'm going to shoot my neighbor when they come on my property. We don't plan on doing these things. Very rarely. I think there are some very twisted off people who intentionally do these things, but I think most part, we never intend to end up in these situations. But sometimes it's a slippery slope of oh, well, it's just a few dollars. It's just a couple cups of coffee. Or, it's just a little lie. And then it ends up on a slippery slope that's very difficult to come off of. It reminds me of, in the cartoons, there's many times you see the cartoons and there's a little devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other shoulder. And there's a battle between them of which one do I listen to. Another really kind of well-known analogy is this Native American version of each one of us has two wolves inside of us. The one that's to do good and the one to do evil. How do we know which one wins? Which one do you feed? And then we have a divine principle which shows this in another way. The divine principle explains it in a way that immediately after the fall, when Adam and Eve had the original sin from the fall, but had not yet committed any subsequent good or evil deeds, they found themselves in what we call the midway position, a position between God and Satan, where they were relating with both. So this just highlights that each one of us has inherently our most original mind, our original desires that come from God. Every single person has this deep part of us that wants to be God-like, that desires truth and beauty and goodness and pulls us towards God. We can't get rid of it. Everybody has that side. And yet, due to the fall, we also, each one of us, without exception, has a self-centered or dark side, which, if fed or indulged, has potential for great evil and destruction. So it's not just the central figures in the Bible. It's not just Moses, or it's not just King Solomon.
Moses was an Israelite boy born in Egypt in a time.
Yeah. I said Moses. All right. So it's not just, these historical people. And it's also not just people like George Washington or Jesus who can do really great things. Should I wait? Okay. Okay. But can I get my PowerPoint back? Okay. All right. All right, give me a minute. So the point of this midway position is that actually within each one of us, we have the potential for incredible goodness, right? If we feed the side of us that resembles God, each one of us can do something amazing in this world that nobody else can do, because we each resemble a unique aspect of God that nobody else can replicate. So each one of us has the potential for incredible goodness, incredible truth, and beauty. And each one of us, if we feed or allow, right, that fallen side of us, that dark side of us, to go unchecked, none of us are exempt from having the potential to do great destruction or evil in this world. It's actually within each one of us. So then, how does God separate Satan from fallen people who stand in the midway position? Or how do we differentiate? How do we move from this spot being kind of torn between good and evil, or God and Satan, and go to God? Satan relates with them on the basis of his connection with them through lineage, through the fall. Therefore, until people make a condition, an action, through which God can claim them as his own, there is no way God can restore them to the heavenly side. So God can't just say, well, I created you, and you are my child, and therefore, come to my side, because Satan can kind of do the same thing. Well, you chose me when you fell, even though it wasn't you, it was your ancestors, right? But he can't just take us either. Until we make a choice, or until we choose God, until we make actions that lead us towards God, God cannot claim us. And on the other hand, Satan acknowledges that God is the creator of human beings, unless Satan finds some condition through which he can attack a fallen person. He also cannot just arbitrarily claim him for his side. Therefore, a fallen person will go to God's side if he makes good conditions, and to Satan's side if he makes evil conditions. So it's really, which wolf are you feeding, right? Which choice are we making? It needs to be intentional. I think sometimes we just think, well, I'm a good person, and I want to do good things, so hopefully that's what I'll end up doing. Or I don't want to be a bad person, so I probably won't become a bad person. No, we need to be intentional in our choices, especially in the difficult ones. I'm sure there's been moments where you can think of some time where you're like, if I do this, it's probably the right thing to do, but it might expose me as being somebody who made a mistake, and I don't want to show that side of myself. And so we do a little lie to cover it up or hide it. But it's especially in those moments where we intentionally choose, we think, what did God create me for? What kind of life am I wanting to live, and what action in this situation would lead me towards that or away from it? I remember, I think it was like 2021, we had first restarted school back in person after COVID, right? And I single-handedly gave COVID to my entire school. And probably most of the church community. But it was like, I was like, it's not me, not my fault. Yeah, it really was. But I was feeling sick, and I actually got tested for COVID, and it came back negative. And so that's my excuse, right? Well, I didn't know it. They said I didn't have COVID. And I didn't have extra staff, and so I went back to school, finished teaching the week, and everybody got sick. It went everywhere, and it's very easy to be like, well, it's not my fault. I didn't, they said I didn't have COVID, so it's not, but really, I did, right? So, and I remember, and people were getting sick and kind of asking like, well, how did this happen? And it really took me a few moments to be able to like, when somebody asked me, like, oh, they asked me something about it, and it really took me like, yeah, I'm sorry. I went to school sick, and I got sick, and that's probably why your kid is sick. You know, it wasn't intentional, but it was still a bad choice. I probably should not have gone to school sick, you know. And especially at that time, COVID was so like controversial, and there was a lot of blame and frustration. So it was scary for me, even to just that simple wanting to own up to it and not bringing in all the excuses of why it wasn't my fault. But I feel like that was also good practice for me, of being able to own up to my mistake and take responsibility, which allows me in sometimes more difficult situations to also not just act in self-defense or try to avoid difficulty or responsibility, but to then pause and think, well, what is really the ethical, the moral, the God-centered thing to do? So I think that it's for us to really make good choices, for us to create a family that makes good choices and a community that makes good choices. It's really key for us to know who God is, to know who God created us to be. Because without that, we're kind of just left to our own devices, our relative, what we think of in comparison to other people. Oh, I'm a good person, so this was a good choice, right? But there are some absolutes in life. God is an absolute. And it's using things that are absolute that we can make absolute good or bad decisions. So this is a quote from 1 Corinthians, which I really like. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. So I think God is kind of saying here, like, look, I know it's hard. Life is hard. We face difficult things. People are tempted. It's like, it's not ignoring that there's evil in this world, that Satan or selfishness is real. And yet, God is saying, I've equipped you with what you need to avoid temptation, to make the right decision. You don't have a real excuse. There's no temptation that's too great to overcome. There's no difficult decision that we don't have the tools to make the right decision with. This is another quote from the Divine Principle, which I feel like expands on this a little bit more, but in a little bit more positive light. So it begins with, created beings other than humans are endowed with an innate nature to grow to maturity naturally and become object partners which bring God joy. So this is speaking of the natural world, like plants and animals. They grow naturally to maturity to bring God joy. Human beings, on the other hand, can become true and authentic object partners who bring joy to God only through their free will and free actions. They cannot become the object partners who inspire God with joy unless they understand his will and make effort to live accordingly. Hence, human beings are endowed with emotional sensitivity to the heart of God, intuition and reason to comprehend his will, and the requisite abilities to practice it. So just as the last quote was how like God will provide a way for us to avoid temptation, I feel like this is saying God has given us everything we need to succeed. We have the emotional sensitivity to God's heart. Sometimes we might feel a bit detached from that, but we do all have it. We have reason. We've got logic. God is not just a God of love and emotion, but God is also a God of intellect, science, reason. We have those same characteristics in us to understand God's will. And we also have the ability to practice it. We have the willpower. We have the body to do good things with. A person who relates with God in this manner, right, through our heart, our intellect, and our will attain perfection of his individual character. Adam and Eve, prior to the fall, as well as the prophets of every age, had some ability to converse with God because they had these innate faculties. So I believe what these quotes are saying is that we do have a choice. And actually, it's our blessing that we have a choice. The beginning of this quote said, the world of nature just grows. That's the way they're designed. That's the way God created it. The seed sprouts and it grows into a tree without having to make right choices, right? And sometimes I remember feeling as a kid, like, gosh, it's so complicated. Can't I just naturally grow into a good person? Like, why does it have to be hard? Why do I have to choose? But that actually free will is a blessing, and it's a gift from God. Just as how we feel the most love when somebody chooses to love us, God feels the most joy when we choose God, when we choose to love God, when we choose to love our family or our friends or the people in our life. There's not as much meaning or value as somebody who's like, well, I love you because that's the way I was created and I have to. Right? That's like the animals or the plants. But there's real beauty, there's real reciprocation. That's where the beauty of life is. When we choose to love God and we choose to love each other. So God gave us this ability to choose despite the risk. But he also gave us everything we need to make the right choices. He gave us the heart, he gave us the mind, and he gave us the willpower to choose goodness. I was telling Mike this was my topic for my message last night, and he was like, but do we though? Do we really have a choice? Because we talk about this often. We kind of feel like we've been set on a path, and we like to tell ourselves that we're choosing it, but I feel like many times if we look back, we're like, oh, God was leading us this way the whole time. And we're just kind of following the path that God has laid for us. But then I said, but we could have chosen not to. We could have easily turned our backs and be like, it's not worth it. It's too hard, and I don't want to. Me. So sometimes it's like that. Sometimes we don't get a lot of choices. Sometimes we have one choice in front of us, and we can accept it, or we can resist, or we can refuse it. Sometimes that's all it is. But we still have our choice and our free will to choose the way that God is leading us, and to choose the calling that God has put on our hearts. So I want to finish with this quote from Galatians. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. But do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. So we have our freedom. We have our free will. Yes, we might each have a little devil on our shoulder, or the dark wolf, or our fallen nature, or whatever you want to call it. But it's not an excuse to do both, right? Because God has given us everything we need to understand his will, to understand his heart and his love, and to take the necessary actions to choose God and to choose to love and serve others. So please join me in prayer. Heavenly Parent, good morning. Thank you so much for today and for everybody who chose to come to church today. It's really, I think, shows how much you are working in our life. And it shows our heart to want to be your beautiful children. And even sometimes we feel like we're not worthy or deserving of your love and your grace and your blessings. But when we make the choice to show up for you and to love others and to do the difficult things, Heavenly Parent, I hope we can remember that not only is it the right thing to do, but we are giving our life over to you with every good choice that we make, with every good action we make. We are allowing you to claim more and more of our life and giving evil or giving Satan less to hold on to. We are freeing ourselves from the past. We are freeing ourselves from our fallen natures. And we are stepping into your love and your grace and your beauty and what you want life to look like for us more and more with every good choice we make, Heavenly Parent. Thank you so much for guiding us and giving us the words of Jesus and our true parents and allowing us to learn from the people of history from the mistakes and from the victories. And I pray that we can never just think of ourselves as a small pawn in this world and in history, but that actually each one of us has an important part to play and has the potential to do really beautiful and great things for you in this world, Heavenly Parent. I pray that we don't think of ourselves lightly, but see ourselves as an indispensable child of yours. Thank you so much for your guidance and your love, and we just want to offer this time to you in this message, and I pray this in my name, Michael and Adonia Hentrick, a Blessed Joe family. Amen and adieu. All right, thank you.